I remember it like it was yesterday. What was supposed to be a routine hospital stay for a fractured wrist turned into an encounter that altered my perception of reality forever. It started simply enough. After slipping on some black ice and taking a nasty tumble, I found myself being admitted to Metropolitan Hospital with a severely broken left arm. The doctors had to surgically insert a metal plate and screws to stabilize the shattered bones. Painful, but a fairly straightforward procedure. Once I was out of recovery, a nurse led me to my room, a small, dimly lit space with 2 beds separated by a cloth partition. She informed me I might be rooming with another patient, which was less than ideal but not unexpected, given the hospital's overcrowding issues. "Make yourself at home," she said, with a curt nod, before leaving me alone. That's when I first heard the gravelly voice from the other side of the curtain. "So they stuck you with me, huh?" "Figures." I froze, the hair prickling on the back of my neck as my unexpected roommate spoke up. Slowly, I pulled back the partition to find a man, maybe in his early 60s, squinting at me with a smile. "Don't worry, kid, I don't bite," he croaked, a grin stretching across his stubbly face. Well, most of the time, anyway. He chuckled. I mustered a tight smile, already deeply unnerved by the stranger's sense of humor. Hi, I'm Daniel." "Gerald Wilkins," he replied, still grinning that unsettling grin. "But they just call me Jerry around these parts." Without asking, he launched into an uncomfortably personal monologue about his life story, a monotonous droning that I quickly tuned out. As the days crept by, I learned to dread Jerry's bizarre, rambling stories about the hospital staff and the regulars and their myriad conditions, spoken in a tone of grotesque relish. Regardless of his off-putting demeanor, it was the things Jerry said that began to disturb me. "You see that fella down the hall?" he'd rasp, jerking his thumb toward the room across the corridor. "Sam Petrie. Poor bastard came in with a busted hip, but it's looking like he won't be walking again. The infection's already spreading." He cackled at my uneasy expression. "Bet you didn't know good old Sam got a tetanus shot. About 10 years late, did you? Made all the difference in the world once that bone poked through." I tried to block out Jerry's morbid predictions, but over the following days, I noticed an eerie pattern emerging. More than once, just hours after he'd spoken ill of a patient's chances, the message would crackle over the hospital's PA system. "Dr. Parnassus to room 416. Dr. Parnassus to 416. A death knell, as Jerry gleefully pointed out each time. "Sounds like that chap Charlie Runkus kicked it," he'd snicker. Can't say I'm surprised, though. The old heart just can't keep pumping at his age. Whenever I protested that these were just morbid coincidences, Jerry simply gave me that same unsettling grin. "Keep telling yourself that, boy. But everybody's coin gets weighed sooner or later. I've been here long enough to know the signs." I tried to take comfort in the fact that the hospital's staff seemed to pay Jerry no mind at all. His bizarre behaviors and proclamations didn't seem to concern them, so they must have written him off as a deranged but harmless eccentric, right? Still, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread each time a nurse came to check my vitals or change my dressings. Was the wild-eyed Jerry whispering his twisted prophecies about me to them out of earshot? I began poring over their facial expressions and body language, looking for any clue that they too saw me as another possible customer, as Jerry so ghoulishly put it. After 2 weeks, my arm had healed enough that I was supposed to be discharged. However, the hospital staff kept coming up with one baffling excuse after another to keep me admitted for further observation. All the while, Jerry kept up his ever-darkening predictions. "You ain't getting out of here, Danny boy. They want you to kick it in this joint, just like me." The constant strain of his doomsaying, coupled with my shaken nerves over being confined against my will, began taking a serious mental toll. The hospital's staff psychiatrist took to making daily visits to my room, though she never explained the reason. Just a routine procedure, she claimed. Then, one day, a bombshell dropped that shattered my reality. The doctors had accidentally left behind their full case notes on me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began reading, desperate to find some rationale for why they were keeping me here against my will. But what I read made my blood freeze in my veins. The notes mentioned nothing about my fractured arm or treatment plan. Instead, they were filled with dense psychiatric evaluations and theories about my deteriorating grip on reality. Phrases like hallucinations intensifying and dissociative fugue state jumped out at me amid the scribbled descriptions of delusional behavior. That's when I saw it. The root analysis that made the whole horrific truth click into place. Patient continues fixation on imagined roommate persona. No evidence such person ever existed or was admitted alongside him. I felt the world spin as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Jerry, the creepy old man who was next to me this entire time, had never been real at all. At least, that's what the doctor's notes were insisting. But if that was true, how could I explain all the eerily accurate details Jerry knew about the staff, the patient's conditions, and even the bizarre circumstances surrounding some of their deaths? He wasn't just spewing deranged ramblings. There was a persistent thread of truth woven through his grim tales that I couldn't simply dismiss as delusion. A thought more chilling than the prospect of my own psychosis began taking hold. What if Jerry wasn't a mere hallucination? What if he represented something else entirely? Some spectral, malevolent force that could only be perceived by me? A sinister entity that fed off the misery and despair permeating this place? Jerry's bizarre ramblings ran through my mind. The more I turned it over in my mind, the more it felt like the only answer that made any sense. Of course, the doctors couldn't see Jerry or find any record of him. He was no ordinary patient. This meant his ramblings about me never leaving, about me kicking it here just like him, took on a new and profoundly ominous meaning. Jerry, or whatever paranormal force he embodied, seemed intent on ensnaring me in his invisible, eternal grasp. A cold sweat broke out across my brow as scenarios of endless torment at the specter's shadowed hands flickered through my mind. I had to get out of here. Now! Before whatever game Jerry was playing could trap me permanently in his tenebrous, deathly realm. As if manifesting from my very thoughts, I heard the gravelly, misshapen voice from the empty bed beside me. "You seem awful preoccupied there." The mocking lilt in Jerry's tone made my blood freeze. "Everything all right?" I swallowed hard, my mouth as dry as cotton, and forced myself to meet his piercing, inhuman gaze. You're not human, are you?" I croaked, my voice little more than a ragged whisper. For a long beat, the room was utterly silent, but for the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. Then, Jerry's waxy face split into a demented, teeth-exposing leer that stopped my heart. "Clever boy," the thing wearing his semblance uttered, all traces of the gentleman-like old man now banished. "Took you long enough to figure it out, though." In an instant, the illusion dropped fully away, revealing the aberrant form of smoky, gaseous darkness. It unfurled from the bed like a grotesque, amorphous column of black smog, a pair of burning pinprick embers regarding me with naked malevolence where its eyes should be. "You won't be checking out of this place, Danny boy," the thing intoned into the guttural, reverberating hiss that chilled me to the core. Before the entity could fully extend its shadowy tendrils toward me, I shoved past it and bolted for the door, panic and adrenaline lending me strength as I ran through the hallway. Cries of shock and alarm echoed behind me. "You ain't getting out of here, boy!" Jerry's baleful voice shrieked, the once harmless pet name now dripping with malice and barely contained violence. "You gotta stay, just like me, forever!" But as soon as I hit the exit doors and burst out into the harsh, comforting sunlight, I felt the entity's dark influence slipping away. The lingering amorphous shadows enveloping me dissipated like smoke, dispersed on a stiff breeze. Whatever supernatural force had been toying with me in that place, it couldn't maintain its power beyond the hospital's haunted, sorrow-steeped confines. At least, I desperately hope that's the case. Though I know the memories of my nightmarish encounter will follow me forever. I've never felt more grateful for the overwhelming mundanity of the outside world. All I can do is put as much distance between me and that godforsaken hospital as possible. Perhaps I'll never be able to shake the nagging fear that one day I'll hear that gravelly voice from the darkness once more. You can't escape forever, Daniel. You ever heard the phrase, the silence before the storm? I used to think it was just a dumb saying. That was before my tour in Afghanistan. My name is Michael Kovac, but everyone calls me Mikey. I was an Army Ranger deployed to Kandahar in 2011. Our unit was carrying out night raids, trying to disrupt hostile operations in the area. Mostly routine work, kicking down doors, rounding up fighters, destroying weapon caches. But every veteran knows that feeling, that prickling at the back of your neck, that warns you something isn't right. It was during one of those ops that everything went sideways. Our target was a compound on the outskirts of a small village, suspected of housing high-ranking insurgents. The plan was simple: breach the exterior, clear the buildings, and exfil before the sun came up. We moved into position under cover of darkness. My buddy Franco and I stacked up on the west entry point, while the rest of the team covered the other sides. We always relied on the element of surprise, hitting the targets before they knew what was happening. On Sergeant's signal, we breached. Franco blew the lock and I took point, sweeping the dark interior with my rifle. But there was nobody there, just a few scattered blankets and cooking supplies. The other teams reported the same. The compound was empty. Slim pickings tonight, boys, Sergeant's voice crackled over comms. Pack it up, we're dusting off in 2 mics. Despite the lack of action, my instincts told me something wasn't right. An eerie silence hung in the air, pressing in like a physical weight. The village nearby should have been alive with the usual sounds of roosters and barking dogs. But there was nothing except, wait, was that a faint whistling? The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Say again all call signs. A heartbeat of dead silence passed. Then it came again, louder this time. An unnatural wavering moan that set my teeth on edge. Does anyone else hear that whistling? Desperation crept into my voice as the sound grew louder and more menacing. Like the village itself was exhaling a tortured breath. I hear it, Franco said, his voice barely above a whisper. Damn it, where is that coming from? Sergeant hissed. The whistling became a howl, rising in pitch until it felt like shards of ice lancing through my brain. Instinctively, I clapped my hands over my ears, but the shriek seemed to come from everywhere, worming its way inside my skull. Around me, my teammates were doing the same, some doubling over in agony. Through the ringing in my head, I heard a panicked voice over comms. An inhuman shriek cut it off mid-sentence. Gunfire erupted from the north side of the compound as muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness. Contact north! Troops in contact! Sergeant roared. I spun towards the sound of the shots, trying to blink away the dark spots clouding my vision. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure flickered in and out of existence. There 1 second and gone the next. A howl rent the air as the specter materialized, gliding forward with soundless, drifting strides. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. Was this some insurgent in an advanced ghillie suit toying with us? Or was it just my oxygen-starved brain playing tricks? All I knew is that we were boxed in, with the threat closing fast, and nowhere to run. Time seemed to slow. I opened fire, the staccato report of my rifle sounding muffled and far away. Tracer rounds lanced through the night, but the shadowy figure didn't flinch or take cover, just kept drifting forward with those unnatural gliding strides. It moved like death itself was coming for us. Gunfire raged from the north side before another shriek cut it off abruptly. I threw myself into a crouch, searching the darkness for Franco. To my horror, his rifle lay abandoned on the ground nearby, the barrel slowly spinning to a stop. The reality of our situation slammed into me. We didn't have a chance against this kind of threat. Not here. Not tonight. Pull back. Everybody fall back to the rally point. Sergeant's order crackled amid the chaos. I grabbed Franco's discarded rifle and backpedaled, firing wildly at any shadow that moved. Something slammed into me from behind, dropping me hard to the ground. I twisted, bringing my rifle around, but an invisible force knocked it aside with dizzying force. In the same blink, a face materialized in front of mine, mouth stretching impossibly wide in a soul-rending shriek. That scream will haunt me until the day I die. A fusion of tortured rage and unspeakable sorrow given voice in an unholy wail. It reared back, jaws unhinged and gaping wide. I faced away, waiting for the end. A deafening crack split the night, followed by a heavy thwump as a grenade detonated nearby, the area washing in blinding white light. The specter recoiled, outline wavering and twisting, before dispersing like smoke caught in a stiff wind. Gunfire rang out as my squad poured fire into the conflagration. Go, go, get your asses to the rally point, Sergeant bellowed. I scrambled backwards, desperately trying to get my feet under me. Scooping up my rifle, I sprinted like hell was on my heels, each ragged breath feeling like shards of glass were ripping my lungs apart. Chaos reigned, random bursts of gunfire, garbled radio chatter, more of those soul-rending howls on the scorched air. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted our Humvees idling near the perimeter, the big .50 Cal swiveling this way and that as the gunners swept for threats. I'd never been so relieved to see those bulky shapes silhouetted against the pre-dawn gloom. I pushed myself harder, boots pounding across the compacted earth. The howling grew louder, more anguished, like whatever was pursuing us could sense its chance slipping away with every lungful of air I dragged in. Closing in on the vehicles, a familiar face turned toward me. The glint of reflected moonlight, glinting off his night vision goggles. Mikey? That you, man? Where's the rest of the... His words cut off as my mind recoiled from the horrific implications of what I was glimpsing. My feet were rooted to the spot, legs trembling and threatening to give out, as that nightmare visage swam into focus. The howling intensified, that damnable cacophony worming its way into my brain until all coherent thoughts scattered like ashes on the wind. Just as I was certain my mind would shatter beneath the onslaught, gunfire erupted from the idling Humvees. The heavy thump of the .50 Cals opened up, rifles and machine guns joining in a sweeping torrent of lead that tore the night asunder. The apparition convulsed, shriek cutting off in the gurgling rasp. For a breathless heartbeat, I could have sworn I saw those empty sockets bleeding, thick runnels of midnight ichor seeping forth. Then it started to unravel, its outline twisting and warping like a reflection across a wind-rippled pool. With a final rattling exhalation, the thing simply dissipated. 1 second it was there, filling my vision with its gaping maw and haunting, soul-deep wails. The next, nothing but silence, and the acrid stench of spent gunpowder. I stood there, numb and uncomprehending, my whites clenched around my rifle so tightly, the knuckles shone bone-white through the torn fabric. The ringing in my ears throbbed in time with my thundering pulse. The crackle of Sergeant's voice over comms snapped me back to reality. Everyone sound off, over. One by one, miraculously, the rest of the squad checked in and confirmed their status. Not a single casualty, by some inconceivable stroke of luck. Even Franco had made it out of the compound in time. Then let's get the hell out of this place before whatever that was comes back for an encore, Sergeant growled. Dust off in 30 seconds, move it! I didn't need to be told twice. As I climbed into the Humvee, I met the wide, haunted gaze of our gunner as he swiveled the .50 Cal to cover our approach. His face was smeared in sweat and gunpowder, eyes hollow with the 1,000-yard stare. What the hell was that thing, Mikey? He rasped, voice little more than a hoarse croak. I could only shake my head numbly, at a total loss for words. How could I even begin to describe what we'd just borne witness to? Things that should only exist in fever dreams and ancient legends. Called forth by what? The growl of engines split the silence as our convoy roared into motion, wasting no time getting the hell out of there, making our way back to base under the pale glow of dawn. As we left the maze of mud brick compounds behind, I cast one last glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that nightmarish visage rematerializing in our wake. We were immediately debriefed and tested for signs of psychological trauma or viral pathogens that could have caused such vivid, shared hallucinations. But every exam came back normal. To this day, I have no idea what the hell we experienced out there. No rational scientific explanation can account for what happened. And every fiber of my being hopes I never, ever have to find out. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have paid attention to the stories. But I brushed them off as urban legends and tall tales meant to frighten kids around the campfire. Little did I know the horror that awaited me down that lonesome stretch of road. I should have known the moment I saw him that something was wrong. However, things were about to take a terrifying turn down a dark path I could have never anticipated. But at the time, I just thought he was being friendly. So I waved back. I was driving home from work late one night, as was typical for me as a night shift manufacturing employee. It was around 2 a.m. and the roads were fairly deserted, as you'd expect that time of morning. I was taking the rural route home to my small town, winding along back roads through dark forests and past empty fields. That's when I saw him up ahead on the side of the road, waving at me with an enthusiastic full-arm wave, like he was flagging me down. My first thought was that maybe his car had broken down and he needed assistance. So I smiled and gave a friendly wave back before slowing down, preparing to pull over. As I got closer, I could make out more details in the glow of my headlights. He was standing perfectly still, body angled forward to face my approaching car. His other arm hung limp at his side. He wasn't wearing a jacket, even though it was a brisk autumn night. I rolled down my window a crack, ready to ask if he needed help. That's when I noticed his expression. It wasn't a friendly smile or look of relief at someone stopping. His eyes were wide and vacant, mouth hanging open ever so slightly. He just stared. As I passed, my headlights illuminated his face for a split second, and I could have sworn I saw his cheeks twitch into a slight smile. But it was gone in an instant, replaced with that same eerie blankness. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly rolled the window back up, locking the doors. There was something deeply unsettling about this stranger, like he wasn't quite human. An unearthly presence emanating from those dead eyes and twisted grin. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but every instinct screamed at me to get away from him as fast as possible. I hit the gas, leaving the waving man behind me. The sound of my tires spinning on loose gravel filled the eerie silence surrounding my car. I stole a glance in the rearview mirror and saw him gradually shrinking into the distance, that arm still robotically waving as I sped away. A sense of dread washed over me, and I turned up the radio to drown out the uneasy quiet, trying to put the bizarre encounter out of my mind. I kept checking my mirrors constantly now, half expecting to see that ghastly figure trailing behind me. But the roads remained empty and still. Before long, I was pulling into my driveway and rushing inside, letting out a deep breath as I locked the front door behind me. I tried to convince myself I had imagined things, and it was just a strange person out for a late walk, though a nagging fear still gnawed at the back of my mind. But I couldn't shake this nagging sense of dread, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. Over the next few days, I found myself driving extra cautiously along that same desolate stretch of road, gripping the steering wheel tightly, eyes straining into the darkness, half expecting to see him again. At first, it was just my mind playing tricks, shadows and shapes blurring past that momentarily resembled a human figure. making my heart leap into my throat. But then he started appearing again, far off in the distance at first, just a small silhouette visible under the dim glow of the moon, waving casually, not moving, almost like some sort of mirage. Night after night it continued. He was there, clear as day now, in different spots along that same desolate road. Legs unnaturally still, torso arched forward, arm raised in that chillingly casual wave. Never approaching, never acknowledging me beyond that simple gesture, just waving, waiting. Each time I'd press my foot down on the accelerator, desperate to speed past his waving silhouette. But no matter how fast I drove, he always maintained that same maddeningly slow, casual wave. His presence seemed to leach the life and color from everything around him, shrouding that stretch of road in a cloak of dread and despair. I found myself taking longer and longer routes home, trying to avoid him. But no matter which back roads I took, that solitary shape would eventually appear. It was as if he knew my every move, the casual wave beckoning me towards some horrible destiny I could only begin to imagine. The worst was when it became clear he was moving closer to my home, night by night, getting nearer and nearer to the turnoff I took to my small rural neighborhood. One night, I even saw him at the end of my street when I pulled in, arm robotically waving as I sped past. Terror gripped me as I slammed my car door and bolted inside, locking it behind me. I frantically closed all the blinds and curtains, shutting out the night. But I could still picture him out there, slowly drifting up my driveway with that same unbroken wave. With each passing day, the dread grew more unbearable. I had horrific nightmares. I was stuck in that car on a never-ending loop, the waving man always there, no matter which way I turned, waving insistently as that vacant-eyed figure drew nearer and nearer, summoning me towards an awful fate I couldn't see, but could feel closing in all around. I awoke in a cold sweat, my sheets drenched and tangled around me like shackles. I missed days of work, stopped going out after dark entirely, shuttered all the windows and draped blankets over them for good measure, just hoping and praying this haunting would pass, that the waving man would move on and leave me be. But in my heart, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Sure enough, one night I was awoken by the sound of something scraping against the front door downstairs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or a tree branch blown by the wind, but the noise persisted. A slow, rhythmic scraping that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I held my breath, straining to listen. More scraping and tapping, slow and rhythmic, like fingernails or twigs being dragged along the wooden surface. It went on for what felt like hours as I lay there, petrified. Until, finally, I heard the front door unlatch and creak open. The footsteps that followed chilled me to my core. Heavy, shuffling steps at an unbearably slow pace, making their way through the house, up the stairs, down the hallway towards my bedroom. I stared in frozen terror as the shadow shifted under the crack at the bottom of the door. Suddenly, my bedroom door came crashing open, the force of the impact sending it slamming against the wall with a tremendous crash. And there he stood in the dim glow of the hallway light. A tall, arched silhouette now visible, arm raised as if in a wave. The waving man. Only now he was grinning that horrible, unnatural grin. His body was hunched forward, head sagging. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, back arched unnaturally and arms hanging slack at his sides. That's when the smell hit me. A thick, rancid odor like decaying flesh, wafting from the man, now only a few feet away. I shrank back on my bed, bile rising in my throat. That's when the nightmares took on a new, waking form. I'm not sure what happened over the next few hours. I awoke sometime later, covered in sweat and my own blood. Just fragments and impressions. A rancid smell enveloping me, like something discarded and left to rot. I could barely move. I started dragging myself towards the window, desperate to alert someone, anyone, before it was too late. That's when I saw him again. The waving man, he was standing right outside my house, smiling that awful grin and waving casually. Only now, his gaze drifted over in my direction. His grin widened, and he let out a horrible bellowing laugh that reverberated through my bones. As everything faded to blackness, with the last of my fading strength, some animalistic instinct took over. I raised a trembling hand and waved back. I don't know how long I stood there, waving ceaselessly. Only one thought persisted through my distorted, macabre existence. There would be others, and like me, they would wave back. Hello viewers, welcome to a Day in My Life video. My name is Alex Turner, and I'm as ordinary as they come. If I had to tell you something peculiar about me, I suppose it would be that I have no shadow. I live in a cozy studio apartment in the heart of a bustling city. Every morning I wake up at 7 a.m., take a quick shower, and have my usual breakfast of cereal and orange juice while scrolling through job listings on my laptop. I'm not one for extravagance or excitement. I find comfort in the predictability of my life. Well, about not having a shadow part, it's been that way for as long as I can remember. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, or that maybe I was standing in a spot where the sun couldn't quite reach. But as I grew older, I realized that no matter where I stood or how bright the sun shone, there was never a dark outline following my movements. I remember mentioning it to my parents when I was a child. They exchanged a look I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of fear and resignation. My mother simply said, "It's nothing to worry about, dear, you're just special." And that was that. We never spoke of it again. As an adult, I've learned to live with my shadowless existence. It's a minor quirk, really, nothing much to it. After all, what's a shadow but a dark patch on the ground? Despite that, I'm quite proud of myself for living an active lifestyle. Take my neighbors, for instance. I've lived in this building for 5 years now, and I've never seen another tenant. The hallways are always silent, the other apartments perpetually dark. Such lazy folks, I don't know. Do they not even need groceries? Sometimes late at night I hear scratching and moaning from behind their doors, but I assume they're just nocturnal. To each their own, right? My apartment is on the top floor of an old converted warehouse. It's a bit quirky. Sometimes the lights flicker erratically, and there's a persistent cold spot in the living room that moves around. But that's just old buildings for you. Mrs. Abernathy, my landlady, just chuckles when I mention it. "Oh, Alex," she'll say, "you and your wild imagination. Next you'll be telling me the place is haunted." I always laugh along. Mrs. Abernathy is a sweet old lady, even if she does have a habit of appearing suddenly in hallways, as if she'd stepped out of the walls themselves. But hey, she's spry for her age. Good for her. Last week, I swear I saw her crawling on the walls like a spider, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. But when I blinked, she was gone. Must have been a trick of those flickering lights. She often asks me to keep the noise down at night. "The walls are thin, you know," she says. I always nod and apologize, even though I'm not sure what noise she's referring to. I'm a quiet tenant, mostly keeping to myself. Sure, there are nights when I wake up to find my bedsheets torn to shreds, or claw marks on my bedroom walls, but that's probably just the result of some vivid nightmares. We all have those, right? Though I must admit, the smell of sulfur and rotting flesh that lingers in the morning is a bit odd. My daily commute is a short walk to the coffee shop where I work part-time while job hunting. It's a quaint little place called the Dusty Tome, owned by an elderly gentleman named Mr. Blackwood. He's a bit of a character, always going on about ley lines and cosmic alignments. Last week, he rearranged all the furniture according to some mystical geometry he'd read about. Now, customers sometimes walk in and find themselves back outside without ever reaching the counter. He can be such a prankster sometimes. Oh, I remember this one time. I woke up in the middle of the night, and he was stuck to the ceiling facing me, his eyes glowing red. He was staring at me, his mouth opening wider and wider until it seemed like it could swallow me whole. I didn't quite understand his prank, so I just went back to sleep. The books in the shop are fascinating. Some are in languages I don't recognize, all swirls and angles that give me a headache if I look at them too long. There's one book, a heavy tome with a lock that opens and closes on its own, that Mr. Blackwood says I should never read aloud. The words have power, he tells me, dead serious. I just nod along. He's always been into that fantasy mumbo-jumbo. Though last time I accidentally read a passage, the book started bleeding and screaming. Mr. Blackwood wasn't too happy about that. During my breaks, I like to sit in the small park near the shop. There's an old stone fountain there with a statue of what Mr. Blackwood calls a guardian spirit. It's an odd statue. I always feel like those stone eyes are following me. Sometimes when I'm alone out there, I hear strange sounds coming from it, as if it were crying. The water from the fountain turns red too sometimes, thick and viscous, smelling of copper. They should get the plumbing checked on that. It doesn't look quite the same with all the red on it. Oh, there she is, Miss Patterson. I see her from time to time, sitting on one of the benches at the park. She always sits silently without saying a word, though she sometimes breaks down and starts to sob. They tell me her whole family died, her husband and 2 kids, in a freak car accident. But from what I can see, she shouldn't worry. I can still see them, clinging onto her body tightly, with their blank eyes and torn, bloodied clothes. I give them a wave, but they don't seem friendly. Sometimes they turn their heads all the way around to stare at me, their mouths gaping like fish out of water. On my way home, I stop by the corner store for some instant noodles and energy drinks. The cashier, a young woman named Megan, is quite a rude person. Maybe it's her way of lightening the mood, but I don't find it appealing. Megan insists that there is no coffee shop called the Dusty Tome anywhere near here. She often says that I need a medical checkup or a mental asylum when I talk to her about my day. Once, she even showed me a newspaper with a headline about a fire that consumed an entire block years ago, including a bookstore. But that's nonsense. I was just there this morning. The walk home after work is usually uneventful, except for that one alleyway I have to cut through. It's always darker than it should be, no matter the time of day. And sometimes, I swear I see shapes moving in that darkness. Tall, spindly things that don't seem quite human. Their long, bony fingers reaching out to caress my face. But when I turn to look directly, there's nothing there. Just tricks of the light, I guess. The only genuinely strange thing about me is that I have no shadow. Oh, that makes me jealous sometimes. You all must never feel alone, right? Always having the company of your shadow. They talk quite a lot, don't they? I don't have one of my own, but I talk to the shadows of others. They tell me all sorts of things about their owners. Some even tell me their deepest, darkest secrets and their most terrible fears. And occasionally I meet the strange ones that just scream, wishing to be set free from their torment. I wonder if it's painful being a shadow, but I don't quite know what to do with all that. After all, I am just an ordinary person. Back at my apartment, every time I come back, I find a small, neatly wrapped package on my table. Inside, there's always a perfectly prepared dinner. I don't quite know where these meals come from. I assume the building has some sort of catering service, though I don't recall signing up for one. Or maybe it's just Mrs. Abernathy being generous. The food is always delicious, even if sometimes I find things in it that shouldn't be there. A fingernail, a tooth, or even some hair. As I get ready for bed, I catch a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. For a second, I notice that my reflection lags. You know, reflecting my actions just a fraction later. Or when the reflection is doing things I am not, like waving or grinning a little too widely. These new mirrors are quite an odd thing. But all I think is, thankfully, I have a reflection. It would have been so much more difficult to get ready if I couldn't see myself, on top of not having a shadow. I climb into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. In the darkness, I hear a soft whisper, as if someone's right next to my ear. "You are the bridge," it says, in a voice that sounds like rustling leaves and ancient stones. The one who walks in both worlds. But that's just the wind, of course. I leave my window open a crack for some fresh air, you see? This late at night, I hear other voices too. Laughter and cries, dozens of them, echoing through the halls of my building. The neighbors can be pretty rowdy, I think. even if I've never actually seen or heard them during the day. As I drift off to sleep, I find myself wondering idly why I have no shadow. Maybe it's some kind of rare medical condition. Or maybe it's because I'm not entirely here, not entirely human. That's what Dad said one night when he was drunk, right before he tried to exorcise me with a kitchen knife and holy water that smelled suspiciously like vodka. But that's ridiculous, of course. Just the nonsensical thoughts of a tired mind, fueled by Megan's crazy stories and Mr. Blackwood's fantasy novels. Because I'm just an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. The only thing unusual about me is that I have no shadow. But that's normal too, right? Right? It was supposed to be a quick errand. Pop into the vintage clothing shop to buy a new blazer for my cousin's wedding next month. I'd been putting it off for weeks, stubbornly clinging to the notion that I could find something suitable in my overstuffed closet. But the big day was rapidly approaching, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The store itself looked nondescript enough from the outside. A simple brick building on the town's main drag. A hand-painted sign hung overhead bearing the name Camille's Curios in an elegant script. Despite its unassuming facade, the place had gotten rave reviews online for its quality of vintage wares at reasonable prices. As soon as I pushed through the door, the overwhelming stench of mothballs and decaying fabric assaulted my nostrils. I coughed violently, eyes watering, as I squinted to make out my surroundings through the dim lighting. Rows and rows of clothing racks stretched out before me, the hangers sagging under the weight of crushed velvet dresses, sequin tops, and bell-bottom jeans from decades past. Tucked away in the shadowy corners of the cramped space were dusty mannequins clad in fashionable finery, their blank, lifeless stares boring into me as I shuffled farther inside the labyrinth of clothing. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. "Is anyone here?" "Just a minute, dear," a voice emerged from the back room. The floorboards creaked with each ponderous footstep until a wizened old woman emerged, lips stretched into a thin, tight smile. "Welcome to Camille's. Did you need any help finding anything in particular today?" She chirped in an excessively sweet tone that put me even more on edge. Forcing a polite grin, I explained about needing a blazer for the wedding next month. The old woman nodded knowingly and waved a bony hand toward the far left corner. "Right this way. We've got a lovely selection of suit jackets and blazers just over here." As I trailed along behind her, something in my peripheral vision caught my eye. A mannequin standing alone in a beam of pale light filtering through a grimy window. There was nothing inherently creepy about its features. In fact, with its immaculate porcelain complexion and soft brown ringlets, it could almost be described as beautiful in an eerie, doll-like way. No, it was the mannequin's posture that stopped me dead in my tracks. While all the other figures remained frozen in their typical modeling stances, this one's arms were bent at unnatural angles. Its mouth was open unnaturally wide as if mid-scream. An invisible force seemed to be contorting its body, twisting its limbs into an agonized pose. "Something catch your eye, dear?" The old woman must have noticed me staring, because she suddenly materialized at my side. I jumped at the sound of her voice, but quickly recovered. "Oh, no, it's nothing, just admiring that mannequin over there." Following my gaze, she let out a soft chuckle. "Ah, yes, quite an unusual model, isn't she? Did you know those mannequins used to be a hot novelty item back in the 50s? Stores would have them posed in terrifying distorted shapes to grab people's attention as they were passing by." "How charming," I choked out with a nervous laugh of my own. The old woman's eyes glittered with an almost sinister mirth. Some folks even believed they were modeled after real people, the faces and bodies frozen in twisted masks of agony from their dying moments. I barked out a strangled cough, eyes widening in horror. The old woman cackled, waving a dismissive hand. Oh, I'm just having a little fun with you, dear. Surely you didn't believe such an old wives' tale. Now, about that blazer you were looking for. My heart was still pounding as I followed her to the rack of suit jackets. A fact I blame entirely for why I didn't notice the mannequin's position had shifted ever so slightly until I heard a soft creak behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, as the creak rose to a dull groan, like straining wood being bent to its limits. Gathering every ounce of courage, I whipped my head around. My breath stuck in my throat as I watched, transfixed in horror, the mannequin's arm slowly lifted up inch by agonizing inch until it was reaching directly toward me. Its mouth stretched wider in a silent scream as its head lolled from side to side. Did you see something else you like? The old woman was back at my side, peering up at me expectantly. That mannequin, it's moving! I choked out, unable to tear my eyes away from the nightmarish scene before me. The old woman's pale lips twitched downward into a deep frown. Oh, silly me. I must have forgotten to turn her off before we opened this morning. Before I could react, she scurried over to the mannequin, deftly reaching around to its back until we heard a soft click. Instantly, the figure stilled, arm dropping limply at its side once more. There, that's much better. She shuffled back over to me, smiling. It's just an automated model, programmed to start in a grabbing position to catch people's eyes. My heart was still jackhammering in my chest, but I managed a weak grin, embarrassed at being so rattled by a simple trick mannequin. Right, sorry, it just startled me for a second there. The old woman chuckled. No need to apologize, dear. Why don't you take a look at some of these jackets and let me know if any catch your eye? With shaky hands, I flipped through the hangers until a classic black blazer stood out among the others. This one looks lovely, I think. Excellent choice. The old woman's voice drifted out in a cracked rasp. She snatched the blazer off the rack, her bony fingers constricting around the fabric like skeletal claws. Holding it up in front of me, her eyes bored into mine, unblinking. Why don't you try this one on, she hissed, flashing me a grin. Something felt unsettling about her grin. A chill ran down my spine, the tiny hairs along the back of my neck standing on end. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of this place, to run and never look back. But I remained rooted in place, some invisible force seeming to paralyze me. The woman let out a noise that could almost pass for a giggle. The fitting rooms are right over here. She turned with agonizing slowness. I found myself compelled to follow as she headed deeper into the dimly lit recesses of the store. Finally, we reached a secluded area of the shop, a fraying velvet curtain separating the room from the rest of the store. The old woman pulled it aside with a flourish, gesturing me inside with her free hand. I'll give you a moment to get settled. Just let me know if you need any assistance, she wheezed, the hint of a leer twisting her features. I ducked under the curtain into the small, closet-like space. As soon as the heavy fabric fell closed behind me, enclosing me in near total darkness, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My chest felt unbearably tight, each shallow inhalation like trying to breathe through a tiny straw. The shadows seemed to press in from all sides, marauding tendrils of inky blackness creeping across the scuffed hardwood floor. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, I saw it, a humanoid shape in the corner, swathed in tattered rags. The twisted form resolved itself into the unmistakable silhouette of a mannequin. Unlike the standard featureless plastic models, this thing looked almost alive, its cracked face frozen in a perpetual scream of anguish. Its arms extended toward me, beckoning with curled fingers as if imploring me to join its torment. My heart was thundering like a jackhammer, sweat rapidly beating across my forehead and upper lip. This was no ordinary store. I had to get out of here before whatever fresh hell this place had in store could unleash itself. With a trembling hand, I reached for the heavy curtain, fingers brushing against the thick velvet. That's when I heard it, a haunting noise. It was a creaking sound, like before, but a much more pronounced, much more intent. Slowly I turned, already knowing in the deepest pits of my being what I would find. And there it was, the mannequin contorted into a deranged caricature. Those empty sockets seemed to bore straight into my soul. At that moment, my mind simply snapped, all rational thought consumed by the relentless tides of primal terror. I screamed until my throat was raw, clawing madly at the curtain, desperate to escape this nightmare-given form. Finally, I found myself stumbling back out into the main store, legs shaking so violently I could barely remain upright. The old woman stood there watching, amusement lighting up her deathly features. I had to get out. Now. Without wasting another moment, I turned and ran, heedless of the prickling sting of aged pins piercing the soles of my feet. I ran and ran until my chest burned and black spots swam in my vision. And finally, mercifully, I reached the exit, throwing myself outside into the cool evening air. But as I paused for breath, bent over with hands braced against my knees, my eyes went wide in horror. There, out through the dusty storefront window, were the mannequins, all lined up together. Arms raised, pointing in my direction, and their mouths hung open as if silently screaming at me, announcing that I was next on to join the twisted gathering of damned souls. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when my life took a turn into the abyss. The day had been unremarkable, a tedious shift at the office, followed by a quick stop at the grocery store for some instant noodles and a loaf of bread. As I stepped out of the store, the first drops of rain began to fall, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour that turned the world into a blurry gray watercolor. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd forgotten my umbrella at home. Pulling up the hood of my thin jacket, I made a dash for the bus, stopped just down the street. The rain was relentless, soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. By the time I reached the shelter, I was drenched, my shoes squelching with every step. The bus stop was one of those old-fashioned ones, a simple bench under a rusted metal awning that offered little protection from the wind-driven rain. A flickering streetlight cast an eerie, sallow glow over the scene. I checked the schedule taped to the post. The next bus was due in 15 minutes. Shivering, I sat down on the damp bench and watched the rain hammer the pavement, creating a hypnotic rhythm that almost drowned out the distant rumble of thunder. As I sat there, a strange sensation crept over me. The streetlight flickered violently, plunging me into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. In those brief blackouts, I could have sworn I heard whispers, faint, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows around me. I shook my head, attributing the unsettling atmosphere to my overactive imagination and the dreary weather. But then, as another peal of thunder echoed through the night, I saw a pair of headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness, approaching from the direction where my bus usually came from. At first, I felt a surge of relief. An early bus, I thought, grateful for the chance to escape this increasingly unnerving bus stop. But as the vehicle drew nearer, that relief curdled into unease. This wasn't my usual bus, and as it drew closer, something felt off. It was red, a deep arterial red that seemed to absorb the feeble light rather than reflect it. The bus slowed to a stop before me, its brakes emitting a high-pitched squeal that set my teeth on edge. For a moment, it just sat there, engine idling with a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. I stared at it, transfixed. There was no route number displayed, no destination, just that unsettling red gleaming wetly in the rain. Then, with a pneumatic hiss, the doors swung open. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to wait for my regular bus. Before I could take it all in, "Last bus," came a voice from within. It was gravelly, deep. "You getting on or not?" The bus service might have been suspended due to the heavy rains, I thought to myself. But the rain was getting heavier still. A sudden gust of wind sent a spray of icy water into my face. Overwhelmed by the desire to be somewhere, anywhere else, I stood up and approached the open doors. The interior was dimly lit by a single bare bulb that swayed with the bus's movements. The seats were upholstered in the faded, worn-out fabric that might once have been burgundy. But what struck me most was the smell. A cloying mixture of mold, wet leather, and something else. Something coppery and organic that made my stomach churn. "Where's this bus headed?" I called out to the driver, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet interior. The driver didn't turn around. He was an old man, or at least I assumed he was from the hands gripping the steering wheel. He wore a cap pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. In the same gravelly, deep voice, "It goes where it's needed," he said, "where it's called." I wanted to ask more, to demand a straight answer, but something in his tone froze the words in my throat. Instead, I fumbled in my pocket for my bus pass, only to have the driver wave me away with a gnarled hand. "No charge," he wheezed. "Not for this ride." Unnerved, I made my way down the aisle. The bus was empty, save for a lone woman slumped in the back row. It was a woman, middle-aged, her face turned toward the window. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. She's just sleeping, I told myself. She has to be. I chose a seat near the middle, as far from the woman as I could get without being too close to the unsettling driver. As I sat down, the doors hissed shut, and the bus lurched into motion. We drove through the rain-slicked streets, the tires sending up sprays of water that obscured the windows. I tried to track our route, but the landmarks I knew seemed to blur and shift in the downpour. Buildings looked alien and foreboding, glistening eerily through the rain. After what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes, I realized we were no longer in the city. The streetlights had given way to darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. The road beneath us had changed too. I could feel the bus jolt and sway as it navigated what must have been a dirt track. "Hey," I called out, my fear finally overcoming my reticence. "This isn't my stop. Where are we going?" The driver said nothing. I rose from my seat, intending to force my way to the front and make the driver turn around. But in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. Milky white orbs that held no iris, no pupil. They weren't the eyes of something living. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backwards, my hand groping for support. It found the arm of the woman in the back. Her skin was ice cold, with an unearthly chill that seemed to seep into my own flesh. As I recoiled, her head lolled to the side, revealing a face frozen in an expression of fear. A quiet gasp escaped my lips as I looked around and realized she wasn't alone. In the seats I'd thought empty, there were others. Men, women, children, all slumped in unnatural poses. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Let me out," I cried, my voice cracking with panic. "Please, just let me out." The driver turned to me then, his face finally revealed. It was a face that didn't belong to the realm of the living, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer that of an old man, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. "There is no out," the voices said. "Only forward, only where we're called." And then, through the rain-smeared windshield, I saw the scenery outside had disappeared, replaced with nothing but a thick, absolute darkness. I slumped to the floor, my will to fight draining away. How long we drove in that lightless void, I cannot say. Time seemed to warp and stretch, measured only by my own ragged breaths and the ceaseless rumble of the engine. But finally, after what felt like eons, I felt the bus slow and then stop. The doors opened with a hiss that sounded like a dying sigh. "Last stop," the chorus of whispers announced. "Everyone out." But I didn't move. Through the open doors, I saw not a platform or a street, but an impenetrable wall of fog. It was a mist like no other, dense, roiling, with an iridescent sheen that hurt my eyes to look at directly. One by one, the other passengers rose, their movements jerky and unnatural, and stepped off into that impossible fog. They vanished instantly, swallowed by the mist. I remained seated, my hands gripping the seat in front of me so tightly my knuckles turned white. Some primal instinct told me that if I stepped into that fog, there would be no coming back, no return to the world I knew. I would be lost, not just in body, but in soul. I said everyone out, the whispers hissed, now with an edge of malice. No, I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. I won't go. For a moment there was silence, save for the soft hiss of the fog as it began to creep into the bus. Then suddenly, I felt something grab me. It tugged at me, trying to drag me toward the door. I screamed, kicking out and grabbing onto anything I could reach. The unseen entity pulled harder. I could feel my grip slipping, inch by inch. The fog was up to my waist now, its touch like 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. In desperation, I looked up and saw the driver staring at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes, those milky white orbs, now seemed to hold a glimmer of something. Pity? You don't belong here, he rasped, his voice now singularly his own. Not yet. And with that, the doors hissed shut. The fog retreated, driven back due to the doors shutting it out, or perhaps by the driver's cryptic declaration. I woke with a jolt. I was sitting at the bus stop, the same bus stop where this nightmare had begun. My clothes were soaked, my body aching as if I'd been thrown from a great height. Above me, the streetlight flickered, its glow now seeming warm and comforting. The rain had stopped.